Okay, so let's move to the Voices for Education update. Liz?
Great. So just put together a little slideshow for us. Summit action ideas and recommendations and next steps. I got the clicker here, right?
Yep.
Can you see Diane?
Yep.
So as we all know, on December 1st, we held a forum called It Takes a Village, Voices for Equity and Inclusion. We had about 80 community members there, taking a dive into how we could be more welcoming and inclusive as a community. We, one of the activities, I'm going to put this, that we did was to identify some actions after a long morning. I already went through in a previous update how we framed that day, and you can access that information on the website of how we did the day. But what the data we gathered during the summit led to two sets of data. One were about individual actions that people could take, and the other was about community actions, and we'll get to that. So for individual actions, here they are. Should I read them? Anyone want to read them? Can you see them? I'll read them out loud. To participate in community events and stay connected through ongoing conversation, use of social media, and other strategies. Continue to educate ourselves and our young people about assumptions, different perspectives, biases, and empathy. To make connections, volunteer, and expand our network of friends, neighbors, co-workers, and other groups. And to speak out for people when you witness injustice, advocate for organizational change, individually and through formal groups, such as elected boards. Before I move on to community actions, I should have just told you a little bit about the process, how we got there. We had 80 people comment. After that, the steering committee got together to look over all of those comments, a smaller group of about 5 of us, including student and members of the VFE steering committee went through each of the comments. After going through all of the comments, we coded them and came up with these bigger headings. The data that has every individual comment is available for the community and for anybody who, right now it's available for anyone who participated, but we'll make it available to the community as well, so that you can see every comment that was gathered, how it was coded, and how we landed with these bigger buckets. So individual actions. Any questions about that or the process? So community actions were identified. One thing that I appreciate about the way that it was gathered was community and school, and you'll notice that a lot of these comments include community and school, and building those relationships is part of what this group set out to do. So in here you'll see that some of the community actions we identified was an equity audit in schools. We've talked about that at this table. To create a mechanism for ongoing communication and engagement. To diversify participation and community leadership in the community. To offer free meals to all students. To hire more diverse staff, including people of color, in school and community organizations. And to remove barriers and increase equitable access to students and other community members. The summit was evaluated by an independent evaluator for the Everyday Democracy. Her name is Dolores, and I just wanted to review with you what the results of that summit were, of that evaluation were. It's a quote that these evaluation results offer evidence that the 2018 Community Summit was a successful engagement effort for the Essex Westford community for the following reasons. The goals of the summit were met. Most respondents indicated that they would apply their learning from the summit. 100% of those who responded rated the summit as excellent or good. And over 70% of the respondents indicated willingness to participate in similar events in the future. So her final statement in summary of our work is around the summit itself is that the summit was, before I say that, she found a lot of things that we were good at. we do still have some challenges and things that we're working on. And one of the things that I think she identified well in the report of our work was this, that the summit was less successful around achieving equitable diversity across groups represented at the event. This is something we've talked about, how we're working always on doing that better. This result, however, does not diminish the commitment to engagement shown by this community, nor their aim to become more equitable through creating opportunities for people to come together to learn with and about each other, build relationships, and work collectively to make their community better. So we've come to the end of the 3-year Nellie Mae grant that we received, as we all know. And we're transitioning into the next phase of our engagement work. Oh, Marla, you want to sit here? And so we got some recommendations from Sue McCormick from Everyday Democracy and Reed Dyer from Great Schools Partnership, who we've working for. In summary, they say it's been a privilege to have had the opportunity to work with EWSD and Voices over the past 3 years. They've watched Voices for Education coordinate highly successful events, elevate student voice, influence important district decisions, and set the stage for ongoing authentic engagement with students and community members. We believe this foundational work has begun to create a culture of engagement that will continue to serve the district and the community well in coming years. Nellie Mae has been has spoken very highly of the work in our district as well, so thanks to Sue and Reed. They also did leave us with some specific recommendations for how we could improve on our work. Some of it is specific to how Voices can function as a group, and some of it is how we can lend ourselves as a tool to the board and the administration to help with the work that's done there, keeping in mind that Voices communication is a very separate thing from board communication, and keeping those things distinct as we move forward and make sure we're doing both things well. So some of these recommendations are the ones I'm going to really dive into are the bottom ones. The beginning ones are about the organization and how we can function as a coalition. And then we get back to down to engage the underrepresented people, which is what we were talking about earlier, and an effort and a reminder that we have to constantly do that. And then the foster school level engagement, and I wanted to just dive a little more deeply into that so you can see what these recommendations look like a little bit, coming from the data and from what people said over the past 3 years. So these are just a few examples that we could see leveraging community input, successes and lessons learned from the district-wide engagement to inform school-level engagement, offer trainings for administrators on principles and best practices for inclusive, equitable engagement, and consider introducing participatory budgeting for a portion of the district's engagement resources. And for those of you who don't know what participatory budgeting means, it means you come up with the community identifies some projects and you put it out to vote to the community, and the community gets a portion, usually a pretty small portion of a large budget that they get to decide, and a park or a need of the community that's identified through this way, and in this case, the school board or the municipal board gives up any control over and it goes to the community. So these are some examples of ways that we can work on moving forward with that equity lens that we've been talking about. The other is to adopt an engagement policy, and a specific recommendation to establish an ongoing prioritized district commitment to community engagement through the adoption of an engagement policy by the board. Pretty specific recommendation, and followed up by some ideas that the board can consider, and that as we move forward in our work, an example engagement policy is included in the recommendation report from Sue and Reed, which you will all have access to, and you can look at some of the big detail, some of the finer details about what that policy looks like, but I just put up some bullets of what principles to think about while you're developing a policy for public engagement, which includes evaluation, building relationships and community capacity, how you use the use of information, accessible engagement, informed participation, inclusiveness and equity, authentic intent, and planning ahead. And those components go into how you, the lens you use as in that policy. And again, the model policy is available, developed by Matt Leininger at Public Agenda, who's done work in our community, a lot of work with us in the schools and in the municipalities. So, any questions before next steps?
I'm wondering, Liz, if
Yeah.
you are bringing forward specific proposals for the board to consider.
At this point,
Yeah.
no, we're not there yet at all. We have just identified that the community thinks it might be a good idea to have that policy. The work of the group, and that's actually in the next step, as the Voices group, is to figure out how to move forward, which things have energy and weight, and we are likely, this is in the upcoming meetings, to look at the action ideas that were identified through short, medium, and long-term goals, and see if we can figure out what we can actually realistically look for. And we don't have a calendar for that yet. So I don't know. Kim, do you know when we could think that might be?
I think we had begun conversation of it before the end of the grant cycle, and who is hoping to have a conversation with us to share with us what resources they might offer and our thoughts on how that type of a policy might evolve.
Right.
There really isn't like a pull it off the shelf that is going to apply to us directly, so it's pulling some resources together
Yeah.
and thinking about our values around it to have the policy reflect that. So we had somewhat, in trying to get transportation done, we knew that this wasn't a priority in the last month or two. So I would love to see that I think in the next week or two, we're going to try and, Liz and I, we're going to try and connect with, I'm forgetting her name and I apologize, Kate from Great Schools Partnership. And so maybe February or March, there'd be something for us to at least take a first look at and react to. It's not, I've checked in with VSBA, there's not one there either, and I couldn't find that there was one at the NSBA level either. So I think that it is an opportunity. There's a lot of communities in Australia that have engagement policies, so much so that it seems as though it may be part of their legislation. I don't know. It seems like every time I was looking for something, it was coming up with AU, Australia. So it was really interesting. They happen to be really long and not necessarily directly related to an educational institution, but good ideas. So.
I wonder if it would be worth trying to understand what's happening at the school level now. And I'm going to be parochial, but I know our principal has coffee hours, I think a couple times a month.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something that happens in other schools. I also know we have a teacher in Westford who does parent conferences in the student's home, which is, if you think about trying to be inclusive, what better way to, I don't know how practical it is, but when I think about how to be inclusive, what better way could there be than meeting parents where they're at?
And I know we are lucky in this district. A lot of that is happening. The ELL community does a lot of that, going to the English language learning community, goes out, and we, through community processes, have recognized that going to where people are is, of course, the best way to get them engaged. That's great. Did you have something, Keely? Did you? So that's it. The next steps are up there. The partner meeting is on January 21st. You're all welcome to attend any of these upcoming events. From 4 to 5 at Holy Family is the partner meeting of the people who came together initially to help us plan the summit, and the community members who we're hoping will look at the action ideas and get excited about some of them and be able to find homes for some of these ideas and create partnerships between VFE and some of these community groups. And so we're hoping that energy exists and that we'll move forward with that group. The group, the monthly meeting, we're always looking for people who are interested to join. So please, anyone listening or watching, or you're welcome to come by. We have a couple new students who we have, and we're always looking for that, who will be joining us as we plan the upcoming year and how we're going to engage. And then on the 28th, from 7 to 8 at Essex Middle School, is the community celebration of the summit and what we learned, and presenting the action ideas, both the community and individual ideas to the gathering, and a wrap up of the whole 3-year initiative, just a little celebration of the work that was done. And that's the update.
Questions for Liz? Comments? Thank you.
Sure.
We look forward to hearing more, and at some point, we need to start talking as a board about how we're going to take on some of the engagement work as opposed to putting it all in voices. Right. Okay. Good. All right, let's move on to school board business. Brendan, I think I'll put the monitoring piece right before our discussion about our meeting with Nicole. Okay. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about get an update on student transportation.
Okay, so the timeline update, we continue to have 3 trainees in the process in obtaining their CDL permit, and then 2 newer applicants are going on their way through for the initial checks and screening. We have Jamie and Mountain Transit have worked and developed routes for the contingency plan. They will be evaluating within the next couple of weeks. They'll be taking some existing drivers and evaluating the routes and times, and then generating some recommendations for changes or challenges that come up through that. We're waiting for 2 bus drivers to begin the operating for a contingency plan to begin that, some routes. And then the WINS, initial draft routes have been developed, so the contingency plan can happen. Meeting with the contractor, and then on January 16th to review and continue route work, which is great collaborative work. The Blackboard system is now configured into, can robocall families for late buses, and it worked this week, which is great. Ben has forwarded a new applicant to Mountain Transit, so that's the second one this calendar year, and then the 14th one that has come through him and the work that he's done through and on to Mountain Transit from Ben. The power upgrades that they did on Founders Road at the bus depot have proved, especially these past few mornings, being the very cold mornings, have proved to work, and has definitely improved the buses starting and getting out to route. So those upgrades that happen over the summer and fall really help with the reliability of our buses and being able to serve our students and families better. An action item, beginning in February, we're going to do another round of the ridership for both contractors, CCR and Mountain Transit. And then some threats, the flu season can be challenging, and finding subs for those routes. And then district employees that serve the special education bus have recently quit. Aaron and Dylan worked to fill and piece together that and get it covered. To them for doing that in the meantime, so that that route can run. And then we have such a small number of actual employees with CDL license and school bus endorsement that it makes it really difficult to find substitutes when needed. Do you have questions, comments? Kim?
This is a comment, it was shared with us from Reed, that a school in New Hampshire closed
I think it was Maine.
the day, was it, you had shared it?
No, it was Maine.
It was
Maine.
Maine.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was Maine, that's right, I was like.
Reed
from
shared it.
New
It was
Reed
Hampshire,
shared it.
Maine, yeah, Reed shared it from Maine, that their shortage had caused a school closing for a day. So that is, we are not alone in this misery. The other question I have is probably more able to come to us when the ridership survey happens, but I didn't know if anecdotally you know, with the very cold temperatures, were the public bus stops utilized still in a similar way? Are there shelter in any of those, or I don't?
There
I don't
are
know.
in some of the places. Brian, do you know that? Have you heard anecdotally? I have.
I
have
haven't
not.
heard anecdotally. We'll get ridership, and we can have it broken down by day, so we could go back and take a look whether there was any
Just
up or
curious
down
to-
take
We
for
have
it.
more opportunities next week for some cold
Yeah.
to see.
So we've scheduled some additional
Give this
experiment measurement times, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, cool, thank you.
Okay.
We'd also, part of it is also to look at ridership on our regular buses, because there may actually be more infrastructure for waiting riders on the public transit than there are, because
Like
neighborhoods,
Sitting in,
yeah.
like somebody's driveway or whatever.
Keely.
So when I received this yesterday, I was a little confused about the chronology, but I think I understand it now. Just tell me if I'm wrong. The draft routes have been developed. Next week, they will be tested, and then they'll be finalized by the end of the month?
Yeah.
Okay, now
Yep.
I'm understanding it correctly. I guess my one question, or maybe it's a suggestion, is there gonna be a resurvey of the families that would be involved in these particular routes? Just because some people's plans may have changed over the last few months, and other people may find that, like, if we're just doing K-3 and they have to drive their fourth grader anyway,
Yep.
they won't participate even though they're interested in participating.
The contingency plans are looking to cover, all the geography necessary that would fit into our other policies or our other procedures. So traveling all the geography within the village so that no one would have more than, say, a quarter of a mile walk to a bus loop. So it's working on much more of a transit model than on a route model. So there's quite a bit of, like, we're traveling that geography regardless to whether we have opt-in or opt-outs at this point in time, just because we're trying to take a system at one point that we imagine would take 16 buses and trying to bring it down to a 2-bus possibility. You raise a question, though, or you raise the issue that it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to meet the kind of alternative pickups and drop-offs, particularly with daycare, because our geography is really trying to hone down on where the students live and where they are. So there's been some conversation is that might be something that could be difficult for the district to accommodate, like we do with Essex Town residents right now, where people who do utilize transportation have their kids dropped off at daycare after school. Just, again, the nature of trying to come up with something rather than nothing. And I've thought a lot about whether there's some potential threats to talk about when we come up with a something rather than nothing, because it won't resemble what a future state is, and it will have some limitations like after-school drop-offs for daycare potentially.
So if we're talking about a loops type of model, if everybody who's a K through 3 student in Countryside ends up at one or two spots at the same time, and the bus comes, are they all gonna fit on the bus, or are some of them gonna be waiting 20 minutes in?
We're able to determine stops by taking a look at every child that's eligible for school, geo-coded down, and where the stops would be, so how many students would be at each stop. Of course, we don't police that if somebody walks to a friend's house to get onto their stop, but we're able to protect ourselves from that downside risk of everyone getting on at one stop and having that sort of overwhelm a bus. We're also plan the route so that the route can accommodate all the kids that would be in there, as well as we know that 100% of ridership isn't going to happen. It just never has in our district or in districts that our contractor maintains throughout the state. So we know there's some percentage of ridership we'll get. We're driving buses with the expectation of picking up 87 students. We know there'll be space on them otherwise. And there's some management of, if there's space, does someone get to put their Fleming student on it? And that's, you know, we're initially, as we said, trying to look at a K-3 solution and move up in age, but I'm sure we'll have instances where parents will decide that it just makes more sense for them to put their 4th and 5th grader on as well. So there's a lot, as we introduce something as a stopgap, there's going to be unique stopgap challenges to it. And hopefully it won't then impact people's perception of service so much so that we have a long-term impact of dwarfing ridership.
So what's the impact of Countryside Summit Street attendance and Countryside Hiawatha attendance? So if a kid's just gonna get on a bus, or are there gonna be two different buses running in that same neighborhood?
There'll be a north and south loop. Each one of those loops will serve both schools.
Yeah.
So when I think loop, I think about the public buses doing the high school, and they're coming like every 20 minutes. So to, I guess, Keely's question, is it that they're running every 20 minutes, or they're just,
Since there's only two of them, they would be
they're
running
just two
a single
buses,
loop.
a single
But
loop.
think of
so
it-
it's either you're on or that
Yeah.
time or you're not
Think
on.
of it
It's
that
not like you're waiting.
we're building something much more that resembles not Green Mountain Transit's public transit,
Yeah.
but their neighborhood specials, in which they have a route that is a loop in which it goes to multiple schools and
Yeah.
will travel the geography.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on the update? All right, so we'll all keep our fingers crossed that all those drivers stay in the pipeline.
We're getting hand sanitizer and emergency and dropping it off at the bus.
Good
Absolutely.
idea. Maybe masks
kids
wouldn't
down.
be a bad idea.
Just keep all the kids off.
Yeah, right.
Really friendly hose down before they hop on.
Okay, let's move on to set school tuition. Yes.
So in your board notes, it talked about how this is an annual process. It's actually due today to the AOE, so it'll be sent later tonight after the board takes action. It is a process in which what we announce, we cannot charge greater than, but we don't have to charge up to that. As I noted, or Kathy noted in her work, is that there's a lot of unknowns currently through the agency and some of their data. We're recommending that the kindergarten, the elementary 1 through 6, and secondary 7 through 12, those are the classifications of tuition that we're required to come up with, remain the same as last year, and that the technical center bump up slightly. It was 16.9 last year, bump it up to 17 because we do anticipate a reduction in the 6th semester equalized pupil number.
Questions, comments? We ready for a motion? I'll entertain a motion that we approve the announced tuition rates as recommended by the administration.
So moved.
Thank you, Kim. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Okay, Great. I just moved away from the agenda. Okay. Encouraging voter turnout. Al had asked that we have this discussion, and he is sick. So shall I start with his thoughts, and then we can move from there, because he sent me his thoughts today. So there are some things in here that are stated as facts that I don't know for sure are facts, but he thinks that 75% of our taxpayers don't have children in school. I'm not sure what the demographics is for our district, but we know generally that it's certainly over 50%. He thinks that voter participation declined after, and I don't know what he means, stopped sending hard copies of the annual school report to residents. So Westford always sent it. I think the Junction School stopped sending it a while ago.
Yeah, I think in
A long
2000.
time.
Yeah, because the legislature changed that law a long time ago.
Yeah.
And Kim, I'm
I
not
was just
sure.
gonna look to Brendan to say, like, in the very beginning, I think we may have, and when we
Yeah, I
first
can't-
tried, it was a while
I
ago.
think, I think when I was on the board in 2008 and 9, we still sent the full thing, and then shortly after that, we moved to a postcard with a link.
Yep, and we actually did do, though, a newsletter almost style that was a full.
That's right.
We had not ever
So it was like
gotten
an
it down to a
executive summary
postcard. It was
of
an
the-
executive summary
of the
that was
budget.
a
Trifold.
8.5 by 11 or
Right,
trifold. I
right.
can't remember.
So but
that
this
had the
is
link.
what Al thinks. So he thinks older taxpayers may not have access to the internet or know how to find school budget information. He thinks last year's budget mailing, the postcard, was small print and a tax rate range.
I think, Martha, that was because we didn't know.
We didn't know.
Right.
That
That's
was the
right.
situation with the legislature
Yeah.
last year.
And
We
we ended up
certainly
being very high.
didn't know.
Right.
And we probably won't know this year either. And public meetings provide budget info, but there's little interaction from the business community and community leaders. But he doesn't make a recommendation about that, so I'm not sure exactly what he has in mind there. So his suggestion is that we create a 2 or 3 page mini annual report that would be mailed to everyone. And he has, I can send everyone this, he has some specific things that he would put in it, like accomplishments, needs, tax rate implications, student performance, volunteer opportunities. So that's basically his suggestion, is that we mail something more than we're mailing now. So thoughts and or other ideas about how to increase voter turnout? Here.
So I also am very interested in increasing voter turnout, both around the budget and around participation both as voters and candidates in school board elections. I think from a strategic perspective, however, focusing voter turnout efforts on the elderly is not a particularly wise choice. I think older people have higher levels of voter participation already, and the people who we should most be trying to reach are the ones who are participating in our services. If families and 18-year-old students are not participating in school board votes, then the people who are most impacted by budget decisions aren't participating, and that's kind of ridiculous. So we should do as much as we can to educate students who are at Essex High School and can vote about what it means to vote in local elections and inform them about the school budget. And we should try to make sure that everybody who is involved in our school community is informed about like what times of day they can vote if they're working, and that you can vote in advance and absentee, and try to share that information as well, so that we're not only targeting people who can't access the internet,
Right.
but we're thinking about all the ways in which people have difficulty accessing voting.
So I have two ideas. One of them is sort of in honor of Dave Clough, who served for nearly 25 years on the Essex Town School Board. His idea every year to get voter turnout was to create a controversy. So I think we should blow things up in honor of Dave.
I'd rather put a picture of him.
We could do that. We could do that.
Yeah, inflammatory.
It does accomplish the goal.
It does.
It's not a recommended strategy.
So on the more serious side, you know, it's amazing to me on election day or days when there's votes, the number of people that wear the I voted sticker. I think it'd be fun to create a reverse campaign, I will vote. So somehow, like, get people to wear a badge of some kind that indicates that they plan to vote on the day of the school budget vote, as a way to get people talking to each other about, oh, what's that about? Well, April whatever is the day of the school vote. Aren't you going to vote? As a way to begin to sort of create an awareness campaign. I'll never forget. I was standing with a group of parents. This is a number of years ago now. After what I thought was an extensive effort to get the word out about the vote. And I was standing after basketball practice with a bunch of parents, and 4 out of the 5 parents had no idea that the vote was that day.
Yeah.
And I was like, we had done everything. We had road signs. We had letters to the
Meetings in
editor.
the library.
Meetings in the library. Coffee.
Coffee hours.
I mean, we had done everything. And here were like people that I considered to be like kind of plugged in, and they had no idea what I was talking about. So I think we need to kind of think creatively and think outside of the box a little bit to get people talking about the vote and the fact that it's when it's happening and why it's important. So that's my
Okay,
idea.
I've got Liz, I think you, Andre, Kim, and Murray. Liz first.
So I agree with what Keely said about the attentions to the senior population as opposed to the younger population. I think that's a great strategy that we could take. I also wanted to just remind ourselves that Essex we're terrible at voter turnout for our municipal votes as well as our school votes. And part of the reason that we are that way is because of the complex number of to be an informed voter and to go to the information sessions and actually vote if you're in the village requires multiple times out of your house. I think right now it's for the town budget and the school budget
No,
Information trustee budget.
trustee, sorry, if you're going to the trustee, you're going to the town and you're going to the school. If you're a voter. Anyway, the structure for voting and governance in this community has been discussed and is continuing to be discussed at the municipal level. And there's a group that was formed called the Essex Governance Group that is focused right now. There's 4 members, 2 trustees and 2 select board members who are focusing their attentions on how do we make this better for our community to vote on school and municipal budgets in a way that makes more sense to our community. So I think part of it, voter turnout for our community is challenging, separate from just our school budget. For one, we have something like under 2% of our community attending town or village meeting.
In person.
in person.
in person. If they're voting, on the other hand,
Right,
by-
but still,
by
it's only
ballot,
14%. We're still,
14 to 20.
14 is better than 2, but we're
14 to
still, our,
20.
yeah. So anyway, just to say that this isn't a problem unique to the school budget and that it is something that is being worked on at the municipal level as well.
Okay,
that's what I do.
Andre.
I echo Brendan's comments that I've heard the same in our community, that they just were not aware of when the school budget vote was on. And I think it's a departure from when we used to vote was actually the first Tuesday. But I also would like to understand that I know the number of absentee voting has gone up significantly, so versus actual going in person. So I think there's a combination of putting the message out that you can vote in person, absentee. It's very simple.
You can still wear those buttons just as soon as you can start voting absentee.
You're right.
I will vote anytime between now and whatever.
But
day.
do we measure how many times people access the EWSD website? Is there a measurement? And is that up? That's significant. So maybe we could have like a streaming banner continually
That's a good idea.
advertise, like the vote's coming up, this is going on in some type of like a stream or something, so they would capture, red lights, glaring, bouncing, whatever. Just something to grab their attention and make them aware of it.
That's a good suggestion. All right, I've got Kim, Marla, Diane, and then Brendan. So Kim's next.
I am afraid I might have lost it, so why don't we come back to me?
I'll put you back.
may
at
have-
the
only
bottom of the
7:20.
I know, I'm sorry. I was so excited to engage with all the other ideas. I was like, wow, I don't know what I meant.
Patrick, you didn't mind? All right.
Sorry
Marla.
about that, folks.
I think there's another issue that happens before trying to encourage people to vote. You have to encourage people to register to vote. I can't tell you how many board meetings through the years, people would stand up if you're cutting something, and then we'd go look at the voter list of registered voters. Probably 75% of the parents complaining weren't registered voters. It was very, I thought, shocking, and I don't think it's different, and I base it upon at work and personally letting neighbors know. And then I've given up because then I used to say, well, did you go vote? And I always get no. My kid had this, or I forgot, or this. So I think there's a point where there's some people that would go vote if we could get them registered.
That might be true.
That's changed, right, Diane?
The motor voter piece has changed.
Yeah,
In
that's
fact,
changed
in fact,
a lot.
That's
it
changed a
makes
lot.
my life more interesting than I
They
care
get
to
their
relate right now.
license.
But motor voter, essentially, if you check that box, they help you into the. and
No,
push you
it's
into-
an opt-out now.
Oh, is it
So
opt-out now?
you're
Oh.
automatically registered.
Right,
Unless you
right.
say,
Unless
I
you say-
don't want it.
So,
So for new people, yeah.
yeah, it's a crazy system. The unfortunate part is that people are registered, they're not registered, if they inconsistently vote. Okay, we registered a guy that hadn't voted for 3 national elections and he thought he was gonna be registered. Of course, he never responded to the letter saying, would you like to continue? So he got taken off because the town's weed lists. So part of, yes, maybe the registration campaign might bring awareness. Quite frankly, signs of the major points, like 5 Corners and 128 and 15, and probably at the village, Green up in Westford, etc. High points, okay, where people will travel, and having the big sign that says "Vote today," believe me, those make a big difference, because people will say, "Oh, I saw this, so I came and voted." Okay, because some of them are in their own bubble, and sometimes the rest of life interacts with them and pops it, they suddenly discover that the rest of life is there. For whatever reason. Okay, there's multiple. But people showing up is, I'm not gonna say it's necessarily apathy, but a lot of comments I heard at the polls, because I'm there for 12 hours, it had been things like, well, it's gonna pass anyway, so I didn't come, which I think is a cop-out. But anyhow, that's my personal opinion. But what I would like to say is that I frequent various places. This is the other paper. And the other paper is for South Burlington. And there's your center spread, 2-pagers on schools. I don't know if they do this every week. I don't know if this is a unique issue and they just do it once a month. I don't know. But here you have, they're talking about pre-K last week, just like we were. Okay, amazing, amazing. But they have a synopsis, and it's a third of the page on the board meeting itself. Plus of course ads, and then of course his whole article here on early ed. I'll pass this around so you can take a look. But it's a nice comparison for notes, but I don't know what they do for their budget. But this is the second time I've seen something from South Burlington talking about their budget. Williston has been talking about their budget since before Christmas. And I usually pick that one up on a regular basis. They too do a center page, and it's not just the kids playing basketball or hockey or whatever else. It's this stuff, okay? Talking about what we are doing, or what the administration is thinking about doing. And so I'm not sure how much that gets them in. I'd be curious to talk to South Burlington and say, what's your turnout when it comes to schools? But they may be at the same time as town meeting. We are, of course, coordinated with the village meeting in April, when the weather's slightly better sometimes. So I think it's a matter of us getting out and making that information available. You know, maybe Brendan's suggestion of I will vote, okay? I absentee voted, okay, might be a go one, okay? Absentee voting, by the way, this last election for the town of Essex, between the two polls, was over 60% turnout.
60% of those
60%
voted.
of the registered voters showed up.
No,
No,
60% of the people who voted absentee.
No, actually, that was more like 25%. But 60% of the registered population voted
Oh, okay, I got you.
in the
Okay.
national election. Okay, so can they turn out? Yes, they can. So I think we have to draw, other than Dave Clough's suggestion, I think we really need to, do something, because the audience is non-existent today. And I think this is part of the problem, is that they're not coming to chat with us, So
That's hard to.
that's hard too.
Yeah. Okay, I've got Brendan, then Kim, then Patrick, then Kelly. Brendan.
Don't forget.
So, I'm not sure if the Essex Reporter is still game for this, but they used to be willing to run essentially op-ed articles by the chair of the board. And I think some we know from surveys and other things that the Essex Reporter is sort of the number one or number two place where people go to look for information. And I think having some well-placed articles that, stressing early voting, stressing absentee ballots, stressing the date and the time and all that stuff for voting placed before the election would be really helpful in the weeks leading up to the election. The other place where I think we could either we have an arrangement or we could buy some very cheap advertising is through Front Porch Forum and hitting all the neighborhoods in Essex with the dates, the times, the locations. I think that's also a good resource to get people at the local level.
Yep, good suggestions and ones that we've actually been talking about.
And I know a lot of these things have already been.
Kim,
I was thinking about our outreach to families, and no, there's some sensitivity around sort of advocating in
You
information
can't
out to families.
Right.
But I would imagine that information
You can
out to
provide
families is okay, and I think I feel as though we've historically not done that for the concern that it may appear advocacy-ish. I just don't know that we've done a lot of that. I think we've almost like third railed it, and I don't think we should. I think that we have information to share by virtue of links to the budget pages that are not, they're informational. So I think we want to think about that maybe a little more aggressively or otherwise. Check
Yeah.
it for tone, but just make sure that.
I think we can't advocate a particular vote.
We can't say.
But we can advocate or encourage people
That
to
people
vote.
do vote,
To vote.
and that
To
they,
vote, yeah.
these are their avenues for remaining
Yep.
informed throughout the process.
Right.
And so whether it's, we have our stock language that is going in all other sources, and we ask principals to include it in whatever their avenues are on
Right.
at
Or
appropriate
PTOs.
Fridays.
PTOs
And
have,
So I think
yeah.
we have to use the avenues for sharing information.
Yep.
And then the other is we could go Oregon and mail all ballots to all. I don't know that we have the liberty to do that ourselves, but go exactly. So
My daughter in Utah has her ballot mailed to her.
they arrive at your home, you stick them in a box. Oregon has the highest participation rate in the country.
Maybe we should, huh?
There are currently mail delivery problems in Essex.
Add it to the
Well,
list.
I think it would have to be a state
I
law
think so too.
change to do
A little tongue in cheek, but I think there
that.
are places it's going better in this country.
I got Patrick Keeley. Are you back in the queue?
I'm back in the queue.
Okay. Patrick.
I think Keely touched on it a little bit, and actually Kim just mentioned it as well. Specific school outreach to families, I'm not sure how much it exists aside from the signs that get put out, like certainly in the junction on election day itself, but no prep or lead time before that. I did just go back to be sure, but in the principal's newsletter from last year at board election time, there was no mention of anything upcoming.
That's crazy.
And, I don't know how similar that is across the other schools in the district, but if we require or, ask principals to require to put that in their reports before the election,
Yeah.
then I think that's gonna go a long way towards what people see in their inbox.
We used to, and I don't want to take a cue. We used to also put a colored sheet of paper that said "Vote today" on the door that was pickup door. Literally, I would print that out and run around and put it on the 3 buildings, and just like simple little things
Yeah.
that are the point of sale, if you will,
Yeah.
opportunities.
Yeah. In Westford, the parents who walk into the school, the voting's happening
That's
in
right.
front of them. So,
Right.
Keely.
Since there's an increase in interest in absentee and early voting, but people don't always know how to start that process, bringing that information out really obviously at the beginning of that period might be wise. For instance, if it's at the town offices that you can early vote, put up a big sign, vote now until April 11th or whatever. Get one of those like dancing noodle guys for a week or so people look over there.
Place, right?
And we would at least have attracted the attention of anyone who ever drives to the high school.
Yes.
So,
We know there's a frosty, not a lot of people.
Yeah, that's
not a motionless Christmas guy, 'cause those are still going to be up, but like something that really,
Yeah.
Santa, you don't want to.
Vote early, vote often.
Yeah.
just for Liz Subin.
So I just wanted to be reminded, is it the communication committee that sort of coordinates our communication plan around the budget? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. So in the back of my head, I've been thinking, is there an educational opportunity for high school students here? And I don't know the answer to that, Beth. What do
I
you
don't
think?
know. I knew they came in to register and 18-year-olds, and sure they'll do that again.
The
Yeah.
kids actually came in, this last time in November. There were
Mm-hmm.
2 classes that came in and toured, voting. And then one student came back with her aide because she was blind. And so we actually had them walk through the new assisted voting system. Because the state says they're gonna put that out as a normal way of going. So it was nice for her to walk through that. There could be more
I just
groups
wondered
coming
if
through.
any social studies teachers would be interested in having their class talk about and give the board ideas about, do some research on what voter turnout has been for school budgets in the communities, and then, brainstorm some ways. Maybe no teacher will be interested, but it would be a way to raise awareness.
There's more than one vote a year.
Pardon?
That there's more than one vote a year.
Yeah, right. Kim?
I wonder if, I bet AP is so structured and tight with their time between now and April or May that wouldn't be an option, but regular gov or the global leadership advisories, maybe? I don't know, that they're probably awfully busy too, but.
Well, let's just ask Beth to have
Yeah.
a conversation with Rob.
Yeah.
It might not interest
Or even
people, or might
Middle school,
not,
too.
right,
Yeah.
might not fit into the curriculum. But if it did, it just occurs to me that it's a real world thing that
I know
happens.
It's happening, it's happening right now without, maybe with some adult, but there's also some real activism of students. So there was there was a lot of voter registration that happened in the fall leading up to midterms and so forth. So,
Yeah.
You have a group of people that really take on their adulthood when it comes to the right to vote, and I think that there may be ways that we can there may be ways to spark that student voice without necessarily going explicitly through curriculum or teachers or that structure, because that's the way they're going to learn. There's not going to be a structure around them. That's why we have such poor voter participation.
But I do think if you find a way to start, yeah, I think I've voted in every election I've ever been eligible to vote in since I was 18. Now, it was cultural within my family. That was probably where it came from for me. But if you could make it cultural, if you could make that cultural expectation broader than family, it would be great. Yeah. Keely.
I mean, I have cousins who grew up in Vermont. They're used to there being town meeting day and everyone goes and participates in this vote in a room. That's completely foreign to anyone who came from other parts of this country.
Yeah.
So their parents might not be voting in anything but the November election because it's just weird to vote more than one time a year. And so
Yeah. School budgets
everybody who
are
is excited to
determined
vote in
by
November,
county
whether they're
vote.
going to extend that to voting at other times of the year, when apparently there's 60% turnout in November and we
Right.
usually get 14 to 20%, we can do better.
Yeah.
And if we can inform people that, and another curricular area that it might be of relevance is math for personal financial literacy or whatever it's called. Because understanding like how tax rates apply, whether you're an owner or how it gets carried on to if you're a renter, like, that's useful information to understand.
Okay, I think I'm gonna call this to a halt, but let's come back to this after we've had a week or two to think about it and see where we're at. Okay, so Brendan, we're gonna go to you next.
All right.
Brian, you're going to put this up, right? Okay, perfect. Okay,
Would you like me to go?
yes,
Okay.
please.
So I had homework, and my homework was to take a stab at providing, I guess, a progress report on one of our goals, specifically goal number 9. So one of our annual goals as a board is to revisit the district transportation policy. So taking inspiration from the format of a monitoring report, I drafted this and wanted to share it as one, a report on our goal, and number 2, a potential format that we might want to use going forward as we continue to track and monitor our own goals for the year. So the first thing obviously is just, to state the goal. The second part is something that I think is really important for, especially the brevity of some of our goals, is to actually provide an interpretation. So the goal itself is to revisit the district transportation policy. That could mean a whole number of things, and we didn't specify necessarily exactly what that was going to be, but we knew what the direction we wanted to go in. So I sort of backed into this interpretation a little bit, that compliance with the goal will be achieved when the board or a subcommittee of the board considers the current transportation policy and, if necessary, develops a new policy based on community expectations, equity of opportunity, district effort and experience, and budgetary ramifications. So that was my sort of draft attempt to interpret what the meaning of this goal was. And then what I did is I basically put together the evidence that leads to my ultimate conclusion that we are in compliance with this goal. We've met the goal, actually. So basically, and I won't read every one of these, but I go through and basically identify all of the actions that we took and that the committee took, the committee, the board, and the administration, to realize this particular goal. So I counted the number of meetings the number of meetings we held, the consultation that we did with the administration and general counsel, the dates and times of the first reading, the second reading, the fact that we kind of went back and had another meeting to consider. We didn't quite get there even after the second reading. So, and then also at the end, a link to the policy that we adopted, as well as some of the agreements that we secured from the administration that the procedures would be completed by March 31st for review, and also that the policy doesn't go into effect until July 1st, 2019. So based on my interpretation and the evidence that's provided in this report, I arrived at the conclusion that we have met the goal.
Okay, so I asked Brendan to do the first one because he's had some experience in the past. So I think this is a nice template of how we might have other board members do reports in the future.
Yeah.
So let's go back. Any discussion around Brendan's interpretation of the goal? Evidence? Is that, do you think they?
I may have missed a few things.
I just had one technical question,
Yeah.
which was it technically a second reading, or does it retroactively become not a second reading if you have a second reading and don't approve it? So
Yeah,
what is
you
it
just-
called that we did on November 27th?
Well,
You
we
can
tabled.
still, yes,
We
like you
tabled
can,
second
you
reading.
can vote to approve on a second, and Martha, you're gonna know better than I, but I think you have a second reading and you can vote at that reading to approve or not, so it,
So then the second reading
It's-
continued?
you vote on it,
Yeah.
the action is taken at a
Right.
later time.
Okay,
Yeah.
That's right.
that was my only quibble.
Okay.
I thought it was thorough.
Anything else?
I think if I was being really hard on myself, I would have been a little more cautious around being so specific on the interpretation, Because really, if that's the interpretation, then some of the evidence that I provide should be related to those 4 things that I sort of itemized there. And I didn't necessarily do that. Like, I didn't talk about budget ramifications. I didn't get into the details of some of those things. So if I were to redo the interpretation, I might just leave those 4 things off and sort of let the language of the policy speak for itself, the minutes from all of those meetings. You know, that's, if you, as a body of work, like, all of that sort of tells the story of how the policy came to be.
And in a sense, you're doing that interpretation after the fact,
Right.
as opposed to
Right.
if you'd been doing it right up front. I think you would put a period after necessary and leave it.
That's right.
Yeah. Kim and then Keely.
Keely might have been first.
Oh,
too.
but
Or the other way around, and more using this as an example of sort of a format, is that interpretation, like, if it were something we were going to, a goal we were going to be doing year over year, so we probably have a handful of those in our list, that we might, for instance, keep all of those things there and recognize that our evidence didn't hit every one of those.
Right.
So we'd be largely in compliance, or something that we would not be afraid if the interpretation is what we really want to ultimately have happen and aspire to, then it's fine that not all the evidence is going to support. It should lead to supporting that, but there might be areas that we would say, and we, continue to struggle to ensure that community has had input or something, and these are the things we might do next time towards that end. And so just almost as an example exercise versus the content of this.
Yeah, I think if we were in partial compliance, then I think it would have been incumbent on me or the committee to delineate, like, what are the things that we can do so that the next time, or that we will become in compliance before the end of, the school year, or what have you. So
Would that be down here?
yeah,
Yeah.
down there, I think if it was determined that we were only in partial compliance, then I think we could say, in order to get full compliance by such and such date, we will investigate the following things, or we'll look into the following things. So that's another way to do it, so that you don't really fail. It's not pass fail so much as
Sometimes
it
it's
is,
like progress.
here's the progress, here's what has yet to be completed or done.
Keely.
Thank you for that piece of information, because that was something I was wondering about coming out of this conversation, is like, what do we do with goals that it isn't so clear cut how we're doing on them?
Right.
But yeah, I really liked the interpretation, because I felt it was very reflective of conversations that we had as a full board before and at the beginning of the work of the subcommittee.
It's true.
So I guess if it didn't go in the interpretation to have those 4 items, that putting that, like, we had a discussion about it in the evidence would have been useful.
Right.
And I think already we have the evidence that's relevant to those for the most part. Like, C was part of the discussions with the administration members, so you could just put discussing how it would
Right.
affect district effort and experience.
True.
And like community expectations, we could add an additional piece of evidence that, like, the unusually huge number of, like, 20 community members over the course of 4 meetings or whatever showed up to say something about this, and we received 50 emails or whatever.
And sometimes, the evidence can be the budget passed.
Yeah. Seriously.
So in terms of budget ramifications,
But like, I think the interpretation is really important, because, like, I remember Marla and some other people at a meeting having really serious questions about the word in our goal, revisit.
Right.
And I think that it came out of our conversations in the board meetings what we were supposed to do in order to revisit this policy.
Right.
So,
And I think it's good practice too for us to discuss these things as a board, because it helps us always think about, like, how can we get better about stating the goal,
Yes.
determining and interpreting what that actually means, and then defining some metrics up front so that the work group or the board knows what the goals are in terms of having to prove or to measure your progress and success. I think those are all really important conversations to have.
And I appreciate us even having the conversations, because there might be another time where we're like, I'm not positive about that interpretation, and it lets us have the conversation about what we mean by the goals that we've stated, and it allows us to be reflective in the bodies of work that we've done. I'm sure before you went back through all that, you had that volume of body of work, you had a sense of what it was, but looking at the number of meetings, that is a really positive reflection on the efforts that went into this goal. And I think probably for all of ours, we're going to see some degree that's similar, that lets us really reflect on it. It's a reminder when it feels like we're inundated with stuff that is, we wonder, is it ours or not?
Right. And yeah, it was quite a few people hours dedicated to this particular goal.
Yes, there were. Anything else? So, Brendan, thank you so much for doing that and for providing kind of the example that other folks can follow. So I think we need to keep assigning goals to board members and having reports so we can be monitoring for the rest of the year. Patrick,
Yes.
how would you feel about making a stab at goal number 10, which is to monitor the implementation of the student transportation plan and support communication to the community?
I would love to. Yeah,
Great.
absolutely.
Thank you. And Brendan has offered to assist you as you start working. And we won't do that till February 5th. We'll only do these regular board meetings, okay? All right, let's move on to what, are we okay to move on? All right, let's move on to what came out of our meeting with Nicole Mace. And, okay, perfect, thank you, Ryan. So each of you got a pink card and you made, I think, 3 suggestions of what you would like to see the board do. I did not participate in that. The suggestions came to me. So I thought we could take a couple of minutes tonight to talk about which ones the full board is interested in pursuing further, and maybe some suggestions about how we might do that. So these are in no particular order, so let's just go down through them. What do folks think about whether we need more sessions on roles and responsibilities? To start the discussion, I think I would say that discussion with Nicole was extremely helpful. I feel like it got us over a hump. I think it's something we'll have to come back to and revisit from time to time, but I don't feel like it's immediate right now. Do people agree with that, or do you want to disagree?
Sure.
I mean, I think it's most pertinent when you have new members to join the board, but
Yes.
it also, a refresher is also sometimes helpful, especially if you're working through some contentious issues or
Right.
complex issues.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, the second one is governance models. This is actually one of our goals. for the board, and so we will continue to talk at agenda meetings about how to bring more information forward about governance models. Yes, Jean?
I would just suggest that bringing in a representative of a high-functioning non-policy governance board, which I think was probably one of my items, is basically just
The
would
same.
fit under governance
Yeah.
models, so we could
Yeah.
cross that off right now.
And I think
It's
that's,
possible that the one about what we can and can't do with policy would also tie into discussions of governance models.
right, yeah,
So,
thanks. That's good. So, stay tuned is basically my response to that. The third one is time for board discussion to foster deeper connections. That's a tough one, but do people have specific ideas around that?
I think if I remember Al's conversation, and his requests, numerous requests, have been to spend more time on certain topics. We get our feet wet, but we really should be getting a more involved discussion. At the time allowance on the agenda is short. I've noticed, since I've been on the board, that some discussions should have gone another 10 minutes, half hour, that we sort of got into it, but we sort of didn't. And it was like, times I could understand Al quite a bit as to why he felt that we should have discussed this. Oh, we'll talk to it later. And unfortunately, he's not here today. And I won't speak for him, but I only speak to what I understand. There are topics that we say we're going to get to. And I don't know if those conversations that we said we were going to get back to, that we actually got back to them. I'd have to go back and look. I did not track things as such, but quite frankly, I think my compatriot Al probably has. He's good at that. But there are things I think sometimes, yes, we've been shortchanged. We really should have gotten into the meat of that, because it's really a future policy component that we should be talking about.
So obviously, it's a tough balance as a board chair between getting through the agenda and having the proper amount of discussion. I guess I would ask if you feel like I'm ending a topic before you think I should. I would ask you to speak up. And
I remember him mentioning it a couple times, that he wanted more discussion.
well, sometimes it's a bit about things that weren't board business, and so that's something I have to be constantly evaluating as well. Are we headed down a track to talking about the specific software that's doing our data management? Well, that's not our job. There's a different way to provide that out, which I've done. So there's that as well. Patrick and Kim and Marla.
So I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, sorry, Kim.
I was just gonna indicate that, and it brought me back to this idea of roles and responsibilities a little bit, just because I'm not sure that I would have taken the third bullet to mean deeper, more time on particular topics on the agenda. I interpreted that differently, but I wasn't the one I was not one of the three that had written that. So I don't want to speak to assuming what other people meant, but in Diane's interpretation, there are times, I think we try and keep track for the next agenda, but it may not show up on the next agenda, but I think almost more often in those situations, I notice that Martha will need to tighten the conversation because we're traveling into a space that isn't our body of work, and maybe that's just an explanation of how we'll look to share information that individual board members are interested in, but that really are not board business or anything the board will act on. Not that we certainly might have a personal interest in a particular area and want more information, but I know that it's always a challenge to navigate the time and figure out if we put enough in our blocks for the amount of time the conversation will take. But I would have interpreted that differently, and I don't know if somebody who wrote that bullet has a different interpretation. I thought it meant personal connections, but I didn't know it. I didn't get the connections part.
Okay. Marla?
The way I interpret that is there are times we're having conversations and one of us has a concern about something. Example is CTE and the transportation and why are we providing transportation to them or to the students from the island. So I'll use that as an example. So yes, maybe management, we expect administration, but I keep harping on you need an education piece. So I think when that comes up, it's saying that we as a board aren't educated on that. If we have the education, we have the understanding, then we don't keep harping on it again and again and again. So I think sometimes when we're having conversations and those questions have come up where people are going into something that you think is management, maybe it needs a deeper look at for the education piece. Not to get involved with management, but to have an understanding of how the district works so that if I know the community will ask you questions sometimes, and I think Al gets frustrated if he doesn't have the answers, you know, from listening to him. I think that bothers him, where I have no problem saying, call Brian.
But, so, so I hear you saying we should be continuing to think about what information should be provided to board members so they can then do what is board work.
Right.
Right.
For instance, like, I'm not running again. You're going to have a new member for sure. And you're going to want to make sure that they have the education pieces that they need to come on board and make decisions with you and not feel left out, of decision-making. So,
Patrick?
So I realized that we're having discussion about what deeper connections necessarily means, and maybe there's now 3 interpretations of it. But I do think that maybe there are some examples where, like, I think that maybe 1 or 2 of us on a board might have an innate deeper connection or an innate understanding of the subject just because Kim and Brendan have kids in high school, and Keely and I have kids in, elementary school, and I'm on the RAB, and Diane was on every board in existence back, for the last 30 years. So I was wondering, and I apologize because I think I put something, similar to this. I'm not sure if it was the exact interpretation or not, but that's kind of what I felt, that sometimes I think that members of the board just get they have an innate deeper connection, and that it would be better if we're discussing a subject that trails into that it puts others of us at a disadvantage for, just by dint of, our personal experiences, and maybe we need a deeper discussion around those particular topics where we know that 1 or 2 of us are going to be much more capable and much more adept at leading and navigating a subject than others will.
Okay. I think that's another example where board members can help me out by saying, can we dive deeper? Can we have a deeper understanding? And if it isn't at this meeting, can we schedule it for the next meeting? Kim?
I think that happens on some other boards that I'm on, and I think the thing to be cautious of is having individuals have pockets, aside from we come to it with the experiences that we do because of our
Right.
kids or whatever other. As we are asking for deeper conversation on areas, I think trying to figure out where it fits on an agenda and in the framework or the lens of how it relates to board work would be important, because if individually we start to become experts in little pockets of things that aren't necessarily board work, we may have a perspective that's different, but then we come to the conversation with really different knowledge levels to have the conversation about the part of it that is board work. And so just thinking about how we share our learning would be
Right.
important.
All right, receive evidence that district is meeting student needs. I think that's definitely part of the continuous improvement plan, and it's certainly contained in our mapping of the board meetings for the year. District unity challenges. Somebody help me out with that.
I think perspective on it is that even though we are one district, and we cannot get away from the fact that we are still, in essence, 3 communities. We've pulled together to be a school district, but I think we still have to recognize that there is still 3 communities that came together, and I think that that's going to be a challenge to continually pull the communities together.
How do we keep making ourselves get to a place where we're thinking, this is a single school district,
Right.
what's best for all students, instead of through the lens that many of us have served on other
Right.
boards, so our instinct may be to go back to that old school district lens. Keely?
Can I suggest putting 2 of the other bullets like as subcategories to that one? Namely the one just below it, sharing resources between school buildings to create opportunities,
Yeah.
and the explore at-large voting.
Yeah.
Since both of those are about
Yep. Trying to
breaking
create
down boundaries
Just gonna
within the
pull it
district.
together.
Trying to create a sense of one. And I think the sharing resources is really an administrative task. I think we can certainly say that's something we want to have happen.
Yeah.
The issue around voting, I think we should put that on an agenda sometime. And I would suggest, Keely, maybe you bring it up at our retreat next summer.
Okay.
And we can start talking about what that would mean, what would it look like, and we could start talking about whether it's something we want to pursue or not. Okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Martha?
Yes.
Before you go on, that sharing resources between school buildings to create opportunities, I think in the future, you're gonna wanna be very, clear, like it's probably under strategic planning, but I think you're going to see the schools within the one school district having to change. For instance, like you've got a lot of parents that want that outdoor opportunity. I think there needs to be in that strategic planning that would also come under strategic planning. Because I see that coming upon us. We've got so many schools within the district. To me, there's so much that we could do, thinking outside the box. with what we've got and what we can do. And I think sitting here on a board, I get bored listening to, I'm sorry, all the minutia of this, but what I get excited about is strategic planning, and give me an outlook here and how the schools are gonna look in 5 years. So,
Okay, so that's spilling over into the next one. And
I think it's part of it.
I think one of the struggles is their strategic planning for the district, which is the continuous improvement plan. And then, should there be strategic planning for the board? We were in an agenda meeting last week, and Brian said businesses aren't doing 5-year strategic plans anymore. And I went, what? So, Brian, do you want to talk about that for a second?
A lot, I would say over the last 10 years, the cycles move certainly away from 5, completely away from 5. Some continue to hold on to 3. The new process is one in which there's a strategic intent, and then there's a continued, almost a perpetual process of determining strategies towards that vision. And it's more dynamic because it embraces the idea of the volatility and uncertainty and ambiguity that exists. The idea of a 5-year plan, just now as you look at it, it just doesn't apply, because
on the shelf.
yeah, and it just has no ability to be that clairvoyant 5 years out and understand what the opportunities and threats could be.
Because society is changing so quickly.
But that's to say that you also, in this environment, you cannot operate without a vision or a strategic intent.
Right. And so at some point, I think the board probably needs to talk about what's our role in the district's vision and the district's continuous improvement plan. And are there pieces that don't fit into the administration's part that the board should be focusing on? So I think I would suggest we do it after we get through budget, but I think it would be good to start having those discussions. Kiwi and then Kim.
So, I think this is probably one of mine again, and I don't honestly care if businesses make formal 5-year strategic plans. What I'm saying is, if it feels like we're only looking 1 year down the pike, and we're never considering the big picture trends that could affect our district, like the example that I always use is, what if they closed the fab? Right. Being aware that there is a extreme negative point that we could potentially face. We don't have to talk about it a lot, just knowing these are the brackets, We could have amazing economic success, which means that the main challenges are managing all the traffic through the 5 corners as it turns into a superhighway. And at the other end, our population and our property tax intake completely tanking in the space of a few years. Are we aware of those? And we never talk about an awareness of that. Is the administration talking about an awareness of that? If so, we don't have to. Just knowing that it's on the radar.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, good point. Kim?
I think I feel similarly, Kelly, that the continuous improvement plan is looking at our academic expectations, and I imagine we certainly have facilities considerations, and I'm hoping our capital plan will maybe looking at that and speaking to that a little differently as we move forward. But I think considering those extremes, or even the aspirations I am thinking about the work that MMU's Unified District, modified whatever they are, they've really done some really innovative work, or had the opportunity to do that with unification. They've had an immersion language area. They are centralizing preschooling to one of the buildings that used to be one of their smaller elementary schools. So that doesn't happen overnight. And if we are considering utilizing our resources to create additional opportunities, as Marla is speaking, I think that thinking about, even not knowing exactly what that looks like, but thinking about that realm of possibilities, and then understanding how those align with vision and how they are prioritized if they are of interest, and how they get moved towards that. If we don't ever say it, we don't ever get there.
Yeah.
Right.
So I would be very appreciative of that. I always feel at budget time that I'm like, oh my God, all right, what are we expecting for retirements in the next year or two? Like, what are we expecting for enrollments? What's the birth rates? Like, those are things that year over year budgeting one at a time is unsettling. And when we think, I remember in our old days, whatever, our single district, we'd be like, okay, we have bubble classes. We're at our max in some of these grades. How are we expecting this is going to improve? And, you know, we would try and understand what the rates were coming in. We would try and understand what retirement expectations were, and know how we were going to stop being at the razor's edge of our what we said class sizes should be.
Right.
So it just let us think more than 1 year at a time.
Yeah, and my statement has to lay on top of that. I believe that the only way we're going to change public education is to have multi-year plans. That we need to be more insightful than 1 year at a time and looking at our hand and not recognizing that there's a world behind it. So it's strategic planning has meaning. That vocabulary has meaning. The idea of a 5-year strategic plan is what I'm saying has sort of moved out of it. Planning for multi-year, especially facility, looking at your staffing, coming up with multi-year plans is a necessity, and school districts don't do enough of it. I was just kind of keying in on that element of what a strategic plan
Right.
often
What should planning look like? So I think we could put that last bullet, how to be intentional about getting from our vision to specific strategic and financial plans, goes up under, I think what we've just talked about is the same thing.
And to
Hey,
Brian's point,
Martha?
maybe adjust the wording from strategic planning 5-year to like multi-year
Multi-year
or
plan.
longer
Long-
range,
long-
broader
Not
range
longer
planning.
range planning, yeah. Okay,
Hey, Martha?
yes.
Under strategic planning too, I wasn't here for the initial conversation of that job sharing position.
Oh,
I forgot we were doing a kindergarten job share, and even though that's administrative responsibilities, I think as you're talking long-range planning, it would be nice for the board to be educated of the type of possibilities that are out there for the staff. And because as you're looking at multi-years out, and if you, like Kim said, which we had in the junction one time, you have a bubble or you have an extreme decrease, then it's nice to know in advance what the potential model could be, and is it the proper way to look at the budget for a 1 or 2 year fix? Is that
Right.
the real long-range way to look at it? Is it
Right.
appropriate?
But also how is being unified changing those conversations? Because you have the ability to move staff between schools to accommodate those situations, which you didn't have in the past.
Right.
And we should be hearing about that. Okay, I'm going to move us along. Set one metric for each board goal and revisit one per month. We're in the process of doing that. Equity, I feel like our book discussion is focused on that conversation. Our Voices for Education is focused on that conversation. And I think our continuous improvement plan is focused on that conversation. So is there something else the board needs to be thinking about in that regard? Kim?
I think, what did we call it earlier in the meeting? Equity audit or inventory? The idea that around budgeting, we'll have some sense of that as we look at resources and where they're needed. And also around student outcomes and basically reporting on things like discipline and otherwise, as we discussed out of our book conversation last time, so that the lens of student information as it's shared with us is done so in that comprehensive way, not only by virtue of an assessment, for instance, that that lens overlays all student information that we get. Would be great. I think Patrick actually had talked about that at the last meeting as well.
Yeah, right now we're getting,
Presentation about how we're doing.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're getting SBAC scores for grade levels, but, you know, seeing that broken down by FLR and
Yeah.
by, you know,
Right.
you know, race and, you know.
I don't know if you saw the recent article. I don't even remember where I read it, but the AOE is having trouble getting that information to school districts this year.
It'll be easier when
We
we're
don't,
one district.
we don't have our APM. Brian, we don't have APM. No. Like,
We've got
it
equalized
did just
people today,
come
just
out.
came up.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. Like, I know earlier this week
Good.
they hadn't gotten
We
it.
got
to
version
me.
7 today of regular equalized and version 2.
Okay. All right.
Should they say how many versions they anticipated releasing?
Are we ready to move along? Diane?
On equity, can we put down the equity issue versus the promises of merger versus how, I guess, an example is, you know, how's the equity between ADL and EMS dealing with extracurriculars? Or even curriculars. I mean, we had a French teacher, French, Spanish come and say, you know, some of them are getting it 3 days a week, some are getting 5 days a week. Is that equitable when it comes to curricular? Or somebody's got, how is that being addressed? I guess is the question.
I can't answer that at
I-
this
I-
time.
I
We
know.
can put that on
That-
our
that is-
agenda
that's
though,
what
because
we
I've
mean
been
by
trying to
equity
deal with
audit,
it.
though?
That's
That
what I
we-
was,
That's exactly
that's what I
right.
mean
That we-
with respect
yeah.
to budget.
That-
I definitely, in
Yeah.
that's sort of the lens that,
We're gonna have that
knowing I
information.
think Westford doesn't even have a foreign language,
Yeah, they
right?
do.
Or-
They
so-
do. French.
They have one.
They
They have French.
have it, but they don't have world language from K through
Well,
8.
nobody does now.
Nobody does now.
No.
That'd be
Anyway,
awesome. Let's do
So
that.
I think that's exactly
That's
what
the
Kim
equity.
was
I
just saying.
think that's, yeah, I think
I mean,
that's exactly what the equity.
That's what I was
Oh,
referring to.
okay, okay,
Okay.
all right.
And I think in the book read that we're doing, you know, that we want to be focusing on that core instruction, that classroom. I mean, all of this is important, but the sort of on those elements of equity that deal with literacy, reading at grade level, and math standards, and those are, you know, those are the base skills.
Yeah.
And we don't want to have a difference between highly qualified teachers or certified staff, and
Right.
so, but just looking at, I think we quickly go to the other things that we do, and that core instruction is our primary, and that core instruction is also something that starts to really help us understand equity, to what do we need to put in so everyone can have the same outcomes, opposed to everyone having the same offerings, is not equity.
Right, well, I mean, I'm familiar with facilities, it's kind of like, does our facilities match with our expectations for having the equity and meeting our core curriculum? Is there ways for us to provide equity by having possibly some movement in our facilities, or changing some of our facilities to meet our expectations for core curriculum?
Yeah.
And so that's not just the programmatic piece, but it's how is our facilities meeting our expectations for program? Not just the sports fields, but you know, I want everybody to have that same equity and get math and reading and all the other stuff too.
Yeah.
So it's, facilities can trip you up.
I was more thinking that as we were talking about promise of merger and increased opportunities, the last thing we want a budget to do is exacerbate places where, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, or maybe 2 or 3, we didn't know if we were adding a volleyball coach at a school where there was already one, or we just didn't want to, within the budget, create further inequity if that wasn't something that was already being offered in both middle schools. Then do we add a volleyball coach at just one middle school? And so through the budget process, it's really, that piece feels different to me from wanting to hear about our student outcomes through the lens of equity in terms of how we supporting all students. When I think about sort of equity inventory as it relates to budget, I'm thinking more how many students are participating in extracurricular. More so because we changed school schedule. Can we see year over year that empirically has either remained the same, or has it changed dramatically, and is that an issue to be considered? Particularly in a year with so much change, I would love to see that in the context of what's coming up for the coming year and what's being resourced through the budget for this year, how are we doing in terms of those opportunities offered for students across similar grade levels? And that would be, it doesn't have to be perfectly aligned, it just has to be acknowledged. So
It's
to
never
know,
gonna be.
it's
We
never going to
we
be,
don't
and
have
just to know that.
enough kids in Westford to.
And we might have opportunities to just put a whole middle school team of something together, because now we've got 3 middle schools. Like, until we put it someplace, we don't even necessarily know what that looks like. So that'd be helpful.
Okay. All right, thanks. I think that was a good discussion, and we'll keep these things in mind as we conduct meetings and as we plan agendas.
Are you
Alright.
adding
wanna add
an
audit?
explanation of that equity?
To put equity audit, or is that what you're doing?
Equity audit or something, everything we've discussed
Or,
it.
yeah,
Audit
equity
and
audit
inventory.
and equity lenses when considering budget. Yeah. Okay.
Equity lens for budget review or
Right.
budget discussions.
Okay. All right, Superintendent Report. Did you just want questions, or did you
Sure.
want to go over?
I think I'll take
pieces?
questions, but first, as you know, legislation today passed the resolution declaring January as the School Board Recognition Month. So we have certificates for you. We did print out the resolution, and there are snacks and appreciation for all the work that you do. Sure, you can ask questions while I pass out certificates.
Questions on the superintendent's report? Thank you. Anybody?
Let me just pull it back up.
All right, I'm going to move us along then, but thank you, Beth, for all the work that you and your leadership team are doing. It's impressive. Okay, any further updates on communications, Liz? Liz?
Sorry, communications. Any updates from us, from last week? I don't think so. I think we're good with voices. I think that was the update for us for this week.
Okay.
The quality development initiative.
Quality youth development.
Initiative to look at the community through 10 benchmarks and supporting youth. It appears as though we won't need, Voices for Education as a body won't need to be a sponsoring agency for it, but if can convene a steering committee with commitment, then we can do that. So Liz and I are both committed to that, along with a few others that we know already. are committed to that, and we're seeking students for that as well at this point, in addition to a business person and, there are a profile of folks we'd like to see at the steering table. I think that Voices for Education will be a great resource for helping to facilitate and schedule spaces and do some of the work that we do well, and capturing it right.
Yep,
So at this point, we are just looking to round out the steering committee and then convene that steering committee to figure out when we would do a broader outreach to get folks to help lead
The
each of those
different
benchmark
areas.
areas. So
So
that was
do
new news that we thought with the body of work that came out of the equity conversations in the fall, that we personally were interested in being involved in offering the capacity and resources that we do, but it was better to find out that we didn't have to be the home for all of it.
So is some other organization going to be sponsoring, or
They
did
don't
they
need a
decide
sponsor.
they
They
don't?
decided
They
because there was
just-
so much interest of a bunch of different organizations and people that was gonna suffice
Okay.
for a home. It's just a collaborative,
Yeah.
shared home, or it didn't need its own 501c3, which is what they thought initially.
And they went back to their
Okay.
committee to
That's
decide
good.
that, and I think they're enthusiastic to have Essex Westford as a pilot, and so I think they're recognizing that out of the pilot, they may be tweaking some of their criterion as they pull it together for other communities.
Which they're gonna have to do to make it community specific anyway, moving forward, so. And the other thing is, back up to the budget, is that, we're working, the communications team and with, Ben on all of the things that came up today around how we should be doing it. We actually have talked about all of those things, so, so just to know that that's front and center right now for us, and we'll be doing that work.
Liz, as you say that 2 to 3 page idea, had that come up before, like executive summary sort of thing?
Well, it came up as a brainstorm idea, but we talked about last year, we thought it was pretty effective, that card. Al didn't think so, I guess, but a lot of people thought that the oversized card that had the summary information in that format, so this is the first I've heard a longer summary. I've heard the whole thing, and I've heard a card, but I don't know where, we'll have to discuss what we think about a 2 or 3 pager.
I mean, we definitely, like, 2 or 3 years ago, we explored the town option as well.
Yeah,
But
and decided on the
Font
card.
size. It doesn't help with the
But
font size.
I think it's a good point, especially for the
Decide-
non,
the reason we decided on the card was because the annual report that the town had sent out included things like student performance data.
that we
It was
didn't
not
have.
available to us at the time.
Right,
So it's certainly worth revisiting the conversation.
yeah.
I thought his idea of offering volunteer opportunities, I appreciated some of his thoughts that were kind of outside of
Right.
the singular purpose of what's the tax rate gonna be, and
Yep.
so
What's
that,
the
and what's the budget number, so just,
No.
I'm excited to imagine that being considered, whether or not that comes to fruition or how it looks.
Well, and knowing that all these things have to be employed at the same
And I'm
time.
sure that that summary isn't until the whole thing is done, I just don't know what that
Yeah.
timeline is, but that's a huge body of work too, so,
Okay, can we move
yeah,
along?
sorry.
All right, statewide updates. So I'll just say a couple things, and Kim may have a couple things to say. Dylan was reappointed to the Education Committee, and I think that's good news for us. Lori Houghton met with me last Friday because she wasn't able to attend our meeting with legislators, so we went through the list, and she was great. She'll clearly communicate with us if she has questions or issues, and she's working with Dylan closely.
She's on healthcare, right?
Pardon?
I think she's on healthcare this year.
She's on healthcare again and very excited to be there. So the governor gave his inaugural address. It basically had no details, so the budget address is a week from Thursday, and that's where we'll find out everything he's thinking. I'm going to let Kim talk about the statewide school system. I don't think there was anything else I was going to say yet. Anyway, Kim.
Before I try and touch on Dan's proposal, Kate Webb, who's the new chair of House Ed, joined us at our VSBA meeting, and the Senate chair
Philip Booth.
had not finished their
assigning.
assigning. I think one of the senators had a car accident on the way. Like, everything was delayed in the Senate, so he was to have joined us but didn't. But anyway, she was really interested in hearing from the school board association on behalf of boards, and we shared a lot of the very same things that we had shared here. She was pretty refreshing to hear her perspective, and I think she was a former special educator herself. So I'm encouraged. She seems to understand the importance of not throwing too much more on, to be thoughtful about how things are implemented that are already on, to not go changing the rules of things that are out there, to consider if there's space for capital construction to come back into the picture. It was a really terrific conversation. And again, I was encouraged because anytime you change leadership, I think that's an unsettling thing. I was thrilled to hear Dylan was reassigned or reappointed. And with respect to the one district issue, you all, I'm sure, have heard that there was a thought exercise put out there in extensive detail for a thought exercise about the possibility of simplifying all this education stuff into one district, 4 superintendents across the state, no more state board of ed, budgets being set by the legislature, and all that would fly in a breeze that would move every 2 years, as far as I can tell. And I don't think I am like alone in holding that concern and opinion. So the VSBA has provided a response, if you will, a statement on the topic, and trying to strike the right balance. This isn't like a self-preservation, preserve boards thing. This is there is tremendous bodies of work happening out there, initiatives happening that require real leadership that has to happen. We know the challenges of pulling together 2 large districts relatively for our state and having one superintendent do that. Like, it is mind-boggling to me to imagine how a person who's led at so many levels as our Secretary of Education could not see the challenge in real leadership with only 4 superintendents across the state to bring change in a meaningful way to education for kids. And so I think that the version 2.0 of it is suggesting that this is one of the endpoint extremes, and what else is there in between that could simplify and save money and improve outcomes or systematize and widgetize. That wasn't in version 2.0. But I do feel as though I'm not exactly sure how, what strategically the thoughts behind this are. I'm not sure that anybody really has it figured out yet, except that if this is the extreme and they fall anywhere else, or if this is what was put out there as the extreme in the thought exercise, and the notion being it's too complicated and too costly, then it's left to the legislature to come up with another answer. Or so I think the tone that ultimately, after some sort of working through an awesome initial draft that was of a statement to this, I think Nicole struck a great tone ultimately around sharing facts about what this could mean. and not trying to attack anybody. It's just, and good for Dan if he wants to have interesting conversations, because I'm sure he will be provoking that with this body. But I don't know that anybody thinks it's going to, too much will come of it. And my worry is it gets very distracting for real work that needs to be happening. They're so understaffed right now at AOE to help support the initiatives that are out there that have implementation deadlines that are important and are going to impact our kids. So I really, really hope that after this thought exercise has provided some conversation, that they can get to the work of staffing adequately to support education throughout the state. And I think it will be telling to figure out how they take this thought exercise and connect it with the budget presentation.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
is both a fear and, of course, a curiosity, but
Right.
maybe mostly fear right now.
I would strongly suggest in VT Digger today, Rebecca Holcomb had an op-ed about what's come out around this, and it's excellent. So I would strongly suggest reading that. Any other questions or thoughts about what's happening at the state level right now? Okay, let's move on to our next meeting is on January 22nd. That's a budget workshop. We're going to try to keep those meetings to budget and not bring other topics into it. I think it's probably more relevant right now to talk about anything you might want on the agenda for our regular board meeting on February 5th. Healing.
I was wondering when we're planning to schedule future board learnings of reading the building equity book. At some point it might be good to know just like what all the meetings are that will have that, so we know like how much of it will be finished while we're still in the budget process, because we can only be informed about the parts of equity that we've talked about.
We could do that. Do you want to do a reading for February 5th? It certainly
Yes,
would
I
be.
think so. Yeah,
Did we discuss chapter 3 last week?
we did chapter 3 last.
I have read it.
Yeah, so it would be chapter 4. I'm trying to find the title. I don't think I have it with me, do I? I usually carry it around.
Okay.
You do.
I will let you know that I have heard from the staff advisor for the Diversity Club, and they're asking to come before us, and they're gonna ask to raise the Black Lives Matter flag for Black History Month. Right now, they think they want it to fly for the remainder of the year. We're gonna have to talk about that because that doesn't really meet our guidelines. But anyway, I've written back to Andrew Roy and said we will put them on the agenda for the 5th, which is kind of too bad because they were hoping to start flying it on the 1st, but they didn't get to us in time to make an agenda before that. So hopefully they'll understand.
Can I ask a question with that?
Yes.
Is there any chance at a budget meeting to, given the time sensitivity of the request, is there any chance that we could make that an action item at a budget meeting?
I don't think we should. I really don't want to set that precedent, and I've already told him no. So, okay, anything else for the 5th?
So we're talking about a restorative justice or restorative practices presentation, and this equity work that we're doing. It made me think of it again when I was meeting with the CJC today, because she told me that on the staff day for Martin Luther King, there's a big equity lens to that, and they're doing a lot of work around that the CJC is coming in and doing a presentation on restorative justice and using circles to talk about race in the schools. And we've talked before about bringing a presentation to the board table around what's happening with the effort to bring restorative practices to the school. I don't know if it's for February 5th, but I don't think it's for next month, but I didn't want to forget about it because we talked about it a while ago.
Right. Yeah, I just wonder if we want to give more time for things to actually be happening before we bring it to the board. I mean,
We have,
Well, it's
If
certainly
we-
not
we'll
for
put
the
it-
5th
we'll put
anyway,
it-
so we
Right.
can, I just wanted it back on the
we'll
radar.
put it on our, maybe
Yep.
sometime.
we
Okay.
would like CTE to present on the 5th and
Okay.
some of their programs and things that they're doing, which then fits into budget.
Great.
That's just it's a great school to highlight, have televised, go through. It's our school that does the most recruiting and just provides that, and it gives us a little bit more flexibility within the budget meetings and budget sessions.
That's
So-
great.
Good. And I do want to hear more about that topic.
Well, I
But
think it
wanna
also.
talk to Beth about
Yeah.
when it's
Yeah.
appropriate for the board to hear. Yeah.
Well, I also think it fits in with all of our social and emotional learning, and to hear about responsive classroom and some schools doing PBIS and restorative, it's
Yeah,
all,
that's true.
it's a whole package
Yeah.
would be
Okay.
great.
Good.
deep-
All right. Message to the community. I would say Voices for Education update. Student transportation. Are you sick of writing about that?
Never.
A lot of the rest of our work tonight was really pretty internally focused. It
We
might
could
be-
do that
and
there-
it's time to start telling people that we're having budget workshops.
Well, and also that there's an open seat. I don't know when we want to start telling people
Well,
that.
I
if they
think we
can-
need to not talk about an open seat. I think we talk about
How
the
to run
seats
for-
that
The seats
are
that
up
are-
for election.
Oh, right. Yep.
So there are 2 in the town and 1 in the village.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think you can start talking about that. Maybe you can connect with the town clerk to find out when the petitions become available
I picked
to
mine up
be.
today.
They are
Pardon?
available. They are
I picked
available.
mine up today, but they hadn't really printed them out, so.
So as of right now.
So it's the,
It's pretty
it's the
early.
6th Monday before the vote.
Right.
Petitions need to be due in, so I can calculate
I think
back
it's
from
due
the
March
April.
4th.
And I can get
Oh.
those numbers.
Can you get that?
Yeah,
in
for
the-
sure.
Wow.
I'm not wrong about that, right?
The 6th Monday before?
Is when they're due,
The-
right?
That's when the petitions
Is when the
are.
petitions are due, the 6th Monday before.
Are available.
It's March 4th is what they told. No, they're
No,
due.
no,
They're
not
due.
available.
They're
It's when they're
available
due in.
now, they're due in.
So they're due the end of January.
No, they're due
Middle of
March
February.
4th.
Okay. Well,
They're always
we better
due, like,
start
what used to be
getting
vacation.
that
It's about the
information
ninth.
Because
out
the
to
vote is
folks.
March
ninth.
6th this year, and the petitions for,
No,
well, sorry,
it's
not the school
April.
board. I mean,
Okay.
I just mean
Oh, yeah.
the town meeting votes. The 6th Monday means that the petitions are due January 28th. So for a month later, it's probably right around the beginning of March. You know,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think
but
so.
if Kim heard March 4th, that's probably right. Okay, good. So you all set, Patrick?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, now I will entertain a motion that we move into executive session to discuss negotiations pursuant to Title I, Chapter 313.
So moved.
Thank you. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Okay, and I'll invite Beth to join us. Brian, you get to go home. You, as does Kim. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, RETN.